emerging. So ladies and gentlemen, yesterday in several sessions, we heard how the tobacco industry has been exploiting the COVID-19 pandemic to improve its image, to get closer to government officials, to obtain perks for the industry, and to continue to protect its business and to increase tobacco sales. We also know that it is not all gloom and doom because we know that we do have tools to protect tobacco control and to protect government efforts in implementing strong measures. In our session today, we have 4 speakers who will be sharing their experience in utilizing FCTC Article 5.3 effectively. Specifically, we will be hearing from the experience of Thailand and also Australia in countering the tobacco industry. And we'll also be introduced to various tools and resources that are available for us to use. So to get us started, we are going to listen to Jenny Lynn Reyes. She's the Monitoring and Evaluation Manager of SIATCA. She's been with SIATCA for more than 10 years and is now the principal author of the Asian Tobacco Industry Interference Index. And she will provide an overview of the implementation status of Article 5.3 in Asia, and this will set the scene for our discussion today. Jenny Lynn Reyes is also a new mother, and she's attending to her baby, and so we will be listening to a video presentation from her right now. So may I invite the tech team to run the video, please? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for joining our symposium today. I'll be presenting Tobacco Industry Interference in Asia based on key findings from SIATCA's 2020 index reports. The main objective of the Tobacco Industry Interference Index is to measure the level of implementation of the FCTC Article 5.3 and its guidelines in our region. In 2020, SIATCA launched 2 TII index reports following the launching of the Global Tobacco Industry Interference Index. So the first one, the blue one on your left, is the Asian TII Index, which covers 18 countries, while the greenish one on your right is the Asean Index, covering 9 member states of Asean. What distinguishes the 2 reports is the historical comparison provided in the ASEAN report, since SIATCA was able to document and prepare a report for ASEAN countries since 2014. A brief background about this presentation, as I've mentioned, we'll be covering tobacco industry interference in 18 countries in Asia for 2020, almost all of which are already parties to the FCTC. All the information used are publicly available and accessible evidence covering the period of January to December 2019. We followed a standard questionnaire and scoring method that was developed and has been used by SIATCA since 2014. All in all, there were 20 questions covering 7 thematic categories or indicators that are all based on the FCTC Article 5.3 guidelines. So this is the overall picture of tobacco industry interference in Asia. So countries at the top with the blue gradient and with low scores are countries that are performing better in terms of countering the tobacco industry. Brunei by far is leading progress in our region, followed by Pakistan, Nepal, Thailand, and Sri Lanka. Meanwhile, countries in red and those with high scores indicate greater level of tobacco industry interference. As you can see, Japan scored highest in Asia, and as we break down the indicators in my next few slides, you will note that Japan also ranked highest in almost all of our 7 indicators. Following Japan, to APACT, we focus in terms of countering the tobacco industry. Brunei by far is leading progress in our region, followed by Pakistan, Nepal, Thailand, and Sri Lanka. Meanwhile, countries in red and those with high scores indicate greater level of tobacco industry interference. As you can see, Japan scored highest in Asia, and as we break down the indicators in my next few slides, you will note that Japan also ranked highest in almost all of our 7 indicators. Following Japan, we have Indonesia and China, and these 3 are also top countries in terms of having the largest smoking populations in the world. So here's a snapshot of tobacco industry interference in the 9 member states of ASEAN. Based on the historical patterns, we can identify which countries have progressed or have in fact deteriorated in their implementation of Article 5.3. You'll see that Brunei and also Vietnam are making steady progress with continually decreasing scores year after year. Meanwhile, although Lao PDR and Indonesia's scores have both declined significantly in 2019, their scores have again spiked for 2019. And because of that, they've retained their overall positions as the top 2 highest in the ASEAN region. It's also worth mentioning that both Malaysia and the Philippines are showing consistent patterns of deterioration as their scores continue to increase year after year. So for our first indicator, participation of the tobacco industry in policy development. So when the tobacco industry is considered as a legitimate stakeholder and is given access to the policy-making process. So for example, acceptance and consideration of their policy proposals, or treating them as resource persons during policy deliberations, the levels of industry participation and influence are also highest. And this is the case for China, for Indonesia, for Japan, and the Philippines. It's worth mentioning here that China and Japan both have state ownership in the tobacco business, and both countries have allowed representatives from the tobacco industry to join their country's official delegation to the FCTC's Conference of Parties, or the COP, which is the highest policy-making body for tobacco control. Meanwhile, a fair number of countries in blue that include Brunei, Thailand, Nepal, and South Korea and Cambodia do not entertain tobacco industry participation, and they have not designated seats for the tobacco industry in government bodies that are involved in policymaking. So for corporate social responsibility, or CSR, the tobacco industry's activities such as funding social and development causes like sports, agriculture, disaster relief, and most recently response to the global COVID-19 pandemic, these all remain a platform for the industry to promote itself as a good corporate citizen, especially in the case of Bangladesh, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Pakistan, and Vietnam. So for example, in Japan and Indonesia, their government allow the tobacco industry to sponsor badminton, volleyball, and other national teams and the tournaments for these sports that serve as the industry's marketing platform to promote their products. Other countries that are also more accepting to receive sponsorship from the industry because their government resources are limited include Cambodia, Myanmar, Philippines, and Bangladesh. In the case of Vietnam, which also scored the highest for this indicator, the tobacco industry is actually mandated by a national law to provide funding for certain CSR activities such as combating illicit trade and poverty alleviation projects. On the other hand, a number of governments and a number of countries have already recognized that the CSR activities are mere publicity stunts by the tobacco industry and have banned these activities. And these countries are Brunei, Lao PDR, Maldives, Myanmar, and Thailand. So in this next indicator, most governments in Asia, with the exception of Brunei, grant the tobacco industry with preferential treatment and benefits. And these are tax breaks, facilitation of trade agreements, and the flexibility on delayed and weakened implementation of tobacco control measures. For example, Brunei and Sri Lanka are the only countries among these 18 countries in Asia that have disallowed duty-free tobacco products for international travelers. There were also a number of multilateral and bilateral trade agreements that are still in effect or were signed in 2019. The tobacco industry has also successfully delayed the implementation of broad tobacco control measures, especially in China, Japan, and Korea, while also delaying the implementation of larger pictorial warnings in mostly South Asian countries that include Bangladesh, Maldives, and Nepal, and also standardized packaging in Sri Lanka. Also, in 2019, the tobacco industry was also given accommodation by the government to delay proposed tobacco tax increases in Bangladesh, in India, Indonesia, Laos, PDR, Myanmar, and Thailand. For unnecessary interaction, so when government representatives, government officials, and the tobacco industry participate in social and public events, when they interact, especially in events organized by the tobacco industry, some documentation are also have been noted in Asia. So for example, in 2019, during the UN General Assembly in New York, the US Asean Business Council, which identifies and lists Philip Morris as a board member, hosted reception dinners for the Prime Minister of Malaysia and also of Thailand. In the Philippines, a group of legislators went on a study tour in the United Kingdom while being escorted by a high-ranking Philip Morris executive. Also, anti-smuggling and enforcement activities remained a very specific area where the tobacco industry was able to work side by side with many governments in 2019, especially in India, which, as we know, has already ratified the illicit trade protocol, as well as in Lao PDR, in Malaysia, in Myanmar, in the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Japan, China, and Vietnam. So also for 2019, a number of partnerships between the government and the tobacco industry were also formalized. So for example, the Memorandum of Agreement signed between Indonesia's Ministry of Research, Technology, and Higher Education and Samporna, which happens to be owned by Philip Morris, to support the government for making decisions to regulate heated tobacco products. So this opens an opportunity for Philip Morris and for its IQOS product to penetrate the huge Indonesian market. So Article 5.3 guidelines also call for government transparency in dealing with the tobacco industry, as well as transparency of the industry itself. However, there is a lack of transparency in disclosing government interaction with the tobacco industry largely in Asia, and it remains a substantial problem as almost all countries except for Brunei, for Pakistan, and the Philippines do not have a procedure to publicly disclose such interactions. Um, Although there are domestic laws in all the countries that require the tobacco industry to register some aspects of its business operation, so for example, to secure their business permits, none of the countries in Asia has a definitive regulation to disclose affiliate organizations, consultants, or lobbyists, or also agents of the tobacco industry. Another indicator that we measured in this presentation and in the report is the number of conflicts of interest situation in all countries, because one way the tobacco industry can gain influence with governments is by subscribing to a system that exchanges campaign contribution for elected officials or their political parties for political accommodation down the line. So, except in Brunei, in China, in Lao PDR, in Maldives, and Vietnam, all other countries among the 18 countries do not ban political contributions in general. And also another type of conflict of interest situation that we were able to document happens when the so-called revolving door. So when former government civil servants join the private sector as consultants or lobbyists for the industry, or the reverse. So when industry executives or personnel, when they accept positions in the government when they're retire. So a number of these examples happen in Asia, and this happened between incumbent and retired government officials with ties to the tobacco industry. So this is our last indicator, which captures how governments are protecting themselves against interference from the tobacco industry. So in total, 9 countries among the 18 have already adopted preventive measures specifically to implement Article 5.3 and other best practices such as anti-corruption principles and code of ethics to counter industry interference in general. So for Brunei, for the Philippines, Pakistan, and Thailand, their preventive measures apply to the entire government bureaucracy, while some countries like Indonesia, Cambodia, Lao PDR, and most recently India and Myanmar have also put in place preventive measures that apply to a specific government ministry. So for example, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, or the Ministry of Youth and Sports. So in conclusion, and some practical recommendations based on our findings, so the tobacco industry is not a legitimate stakeholder and must not be allowed to participate at any level or stage of health policy development. The tobacco industry CSR activities are actually fake CSRs, and these are merely publicity stunts by the tobacco industry, and therefore they must be banned under all circumstances in all of the countries. The tobacco industry does not deserve any preferential treatment nor benefits from the government, such as tax breaks and trade facilitation, even for the state-owned tobacco business, because these accommodations are essentially detrimental to tobacco control, and these tend to drain governments of potential tax revenues. Unnecessary interactions and partnership offers from the tobacco industry must be rejected at all times. Governments need to strengthen and enforce a policy on transparency that should cover the tobacco industry's philanthropy, lobbying, and political contributions. And lastly, all governments need to strengthen and enforce a whole of government code of conduct that fully complies with FCTC Article 5.3 guidelines and the overarching principles of anti-corruption and good governance. So this presentation and our regional reports will not be possible without our partners on the ground. And with that, I would like to take this opportunity to express gratitude on SIATCA's behalf to all our country partners who conducted the monitoring, documenting, and validating the information that I've presented to you today. To know more about the findings and upcoming updates on SIATCA's work to monitor tobacco industry interference, as well as other areas of tobacco control and FCTC, please do visit our website and our resource center so you may be able to download our available resource materials, which includes the Tobacco Industry Interference Index. Thank you again, and good day.
That was Jenny Lynn Reyes from SIATCA. So I'm sure you all would have some questions, and you can type them into the box, and we'll try and address. So let me go to the second speaker for this session, and we will go back to Jenny Lynn Reyes' presentation later. So I'm going to invite Mr. Jack Quining. He is the Director of Policy and Governance in Alcohol, Tobacco and Other Drugs branch of the Australian Department of Health. Previously, he was Director of the Medical Benefits Division, and he was also the Preventive Director of Tobacco and Alcohol in the Preventive Health Agency. He comes with many years of experience in public health. And Jack will present Australia's implementation of Article 5.3. Jack, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to invite you to make your presentation now, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And just while I'm sharing my screen, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands I'm speaking to you from today, the Ngunnawal people here in Australia. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and any other First Nations people in the audience today. So we're talking about Article 5.3, and as we've heard through many sessions in this conference, the tobacco industry over many decades continues to subvert our policies and programs and legislation with respect to tobacco control. And so when the FCTC was created, Article 5.3 was put in as an obligation for all parties to the treaty to take steps to protect their policy settings, lawmaking and law enforcement from interference from the tobacco industry and tobacco industry's interests. And the particular wording there is on your screen, that parties to the treaty shall act to protect their policies from commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry and in accordance with their national law. So like many parts of the FCTC, beyond the articles, we also have guidelines for implementation, and that's also true for Article 5.3. So we have these guidelines which help us to think about how we might implement this article in our jurisdiction. And again, the focus remains on protecting our tobacco control policies from the industry. So there's guiding principles and recommendations. And the key focus is on accountability and transparency for public officials. So to make sure that we know that the industry often likes to work behind the scenes, and so accountability and transparency are very important in terms of countering their efforts. So as you know, Australia takes its obligations under the FCTC very seriously. We've had some very public fights with the tobacco industry, a lot of litigation, particularly as we were the first jurisdiction in the world to introduce plain packaging, and we were subject to litigation in both our national courts and also through WTO provisions through a number of international legal proceedings. And in 2015, our foreign minister, in a declaration to the United Nations, made Australia's position in relation to the tobacco industry and the FCTC very clear. And two key parts of that statement were that looking at our obligations under Article 5.3, that Australia does not recognise any right to non-discriminatory treatment of the tobacco industry. And Australia believes that all parties to the convention should interact with the industry only and when, to the extent strictly necessary, to enable them to effectively regulate the industry and the products of the industry, and that those interactions should be conducted transparently. So if you like, that kind of sets the scene for my discussion today about how we look at Article 5.3 in Australia. And there are several countries who've gone beyond the WHO's guidance and developed their own guidelines for national implementation of Article 5.3, and they include our hosts Thailand, the Philippines, and also the United Kingdom, who've all developed documents to guide the national implementation of Article 5.3. So we produced and published our guidance document in November 2019. It's the guidance for public officials on interacting with the tobacco industry, and there's a copy available on our website, and I'll give you the links at the end of my presentation to that. We've taken a very broad definition of public officials, so it includes public servants who work in government departments and agencies, but it also includes parliamentarians and their staff. And we've distributed this document widely across Australia. Our guidance document also applies to the e-cigarette and the vaping industry in Australia. So we've gone for wide coverage, and as part of a whole of government approach, we established an interdepartmental committee, and I'll talk some more about that later in our presentation. The guide is not intending to prevent legitimate and necessary engagement with the industry, particularly in the area of product regulation, but it does suggest that consultation with the industry be limited to what is necessary for public officials or agencies to do effective tobacco control. And I'll give you a case study now from the Health Department. So currently, the Health Department is undertaking a major review of Australia's tobacco control legislation. And in 2019, we undertook And then at times, obviously, our colleagues in other government agencies and portfolios are dealing with the industry for advice and assistance on how they'll meet their Article 5.3 obligations. So we provide them with written advice, we meet with them and try and assist them to meet those obligations. So what have we learnt over recent times in terms of Article 5.3? As you heard from our civil society colleagues yesterday, the tobacco industry remains very active in Australia. So we've learned that it's important that all public officials be aware of these matters, and so that's why we've tried to develop a guide that's been endorsed by our government and is circulated widely to both government agencies and to parliamentarians. We've taken a whole of government approach, so we have an interdepartmental committee on tobacco control, and we, through that committee, we remind our colleagues of Australia's FCTC obligations, and we make them aware of tobacco industry activity. It's often the case that for people that don't work in tobacco control, who work in other agencies, they're often quite surprised at the tactics of the tobacco industry. They're used to dealing with other industry players, and they're not used to dealing with an industry player who may not be transparent about the reasons for their engagement. As I've mentioned a couple of times, the advocacy from our civil society partners is very important in terms of accountability, and we continue to keep learning and discussing. And most recently, in my department, for people working in my team, we've been focusing on how we can continue to embed our responsibilities for Article 5.3 into the work that we do. So we've started to make a link to our Article 5.3 obligations in position statements and job descriptions for people that are working on tobacco control. And this week, one of the junior members of my team suggested that we might also start making a reference to Article 5.3 in our performance agreements. So I guess in summary, we're all working with the same global tobacco industry. We're all working with Article 5.3 and the convention, but obviously the local context in terms of how the guide is implemented in your jurisdiction, how active the tobacco industry is in your jurisdiction, these are key and important issues. I'll leave you there with the links to our guidance, and I've also provided our email address. If you've got any follow-up questions, we'd be happy to help there. And I'll hand back to Mary. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Jack. I really appreciate the presentation, and I think it's really important, the points that you have made about taking a whole of government approach when dealing with Article 5.3, and I particularly take note of the fact that your guidance covers parliamentarians and embassies, and it also includes the e-cigarette industry. I think that this is really important and a lesson and a take-home lesson for other countries as well. We now go to our third speaker, who doesn't actually need any introduction at all, Dr. Prakit Patisartokit. And he's among pioneers of tobacco control champions in Thailand, and he has fought the industry directly for about 4 decades now, including defending Thailand when Thailand was challenged before the WTO in 1989. But all of that experience, enriched Thailand to really excel in putting in place strong tobacco control measures. And so now I invite Dr. Prakit to share Thailand's experience in denormalizing tobacco and also to focus on tobacco industry sponsored CSR activities. Over to you, Dr. Prakeet.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Mary, for the introduction. I was listening to Jack, and then two things that came up: the approach that the industry sent letter to other ministry in Australia, and the other ministries send it to the Ministry of Health to respond. This has been the same practice in Thailand. And the second point, I just want to inform Jack and others that Thailand was one of the 3 countries served as the key facilitator in drafting the Article 5.3 index, okay, and 10 years ago, okay. So that's for the background. Now, the term tobacco industry denormalization is very interesting to me by myself, you know, in year 2006. By then, I already working on tobacco control for 20 years. And then I learned about this term, okay, at Washington meeting that the Gama Hood from the Non-Smokers' Rights Association Canada present this small booklet here, and then show explain what is the tobacco industry denormalization. I found it very interesting. Okay, so I show this slide up, and it show the public why the tobacco industry is not normal or legitimate and falls outside the normal behavior or legitimate business. Okay. 6 years later, there's a publication in the Tobacco Control Journal that reviewing the tobacco industry denormalization as a tobacco control intervention and review. And it's what it found is a decreased smoking prevalence. Okay, I mean this is solely for the tobacco industry denormalization. And then smoking uptake, and they use the wording may directly erode tobacco industry power, may enhance public support for political view for structural reform to end the tobacco epidemic. I found that this is the more important effect of the tobacco industry denormalization, and because of this, it affects the smoking prevalence and smoking uptake. They use the language may because it is very difficult to document this in text. Okay, but what I would like to share is that my view, denormalization of smoking must go hand in hand with denormalization of the tobacco industry, and unless your society is quite saturated with the denormalization of smoking, it will be very difficult to denormalize the tobacco industry. Okay. So I just show you some experience in Thailand. We have used three decades to ban tobacco industry CSR, because this is the another side of the denormalization, because CSR is a normalization of tobacco industry, the practice and the smoking. So even though our Tobacco Product Control Act 1992 banned direct and indirect tobacco advertisement, at that time we interpreted that would ban tobacco industry CSR also. And then Ministry of Health informed Ministry of Health that the CSR is a form of advertisement, Okay. But the tobacco industry, they argue this is not advertisement. They're just giving back profit to the society. Okay. So we consulted legal expert in Thailand. The opinion is that we need the legal expert. Not they say the wording of ban of direct and indirect advertisement do not imply to CSR. So that's what we were disappointed, but you know, that's what it goes. So we do carry on tobacco under denormalization activity. Okay, in monitoring the industry activity data. Although we do not get the data from them by themselves, we get it from the press. We get it from the annual report. Okay, exporting industry tactic law violation. Okay, mainly from the internal document from the U.S. Okay. And rebuffing industry statement in media whenever they say, you know, claim some false claim, we will make noises about what they are saying. And we did submit information fact sheet and booklet on the tobacco industry's behavior, and set up working group to counter tobacco industry CSR. We published quite a few publications to inform the public and the policymaker about the industry tactic. This is the book that I like very much. The book by the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, Trust Us, We Are the Tobacco Industry, which detail all the tactics in various areas the industry misled or lobby the government. And we translate into Thai. We have a specific issue on CSR and a fact sheet. So you have to educate the society, the media, and the policymaker. Now, in 2003, Philip Morris in Thailand, they proposed to launch, they want to launch a youth anti-smoking campaign prevention with the Ministry of Public Health. And they donate 3 million baht to Ministry of Education to support smoking campaign project in school. We informed the both ministry, and then they rejected the proposal. So came Article 5.3 that I mentioned. I was one of the person who involved in the drafting. CSR lead to political interference. It should be banned. And then CSR is a form of advertisement. It should be banned. This is the report of the WHO expert group that an industry that kills half its customer prematurely cannot be considered socially responsible. The very least responsibility they should have is to comply by the law, regulation, tobacco control regulation, which they, you know, they usually do not. Okay, so that is not responsibility. So we convinced the government to ban CSR publicity because we do not have a law yet. That is using the Television and Broadcasting Act, old Act, but we use it to ban in the electronic media. At that time, it's mainly radio and television. Okay, but this act did not cover the print media, so the donation from Philip Morris and British Tobacco is continue. Okay. So we use this. I think this is a very good cases to disseminate, inform, especially for the policy maker about the tobacco master settlement agreement where actually altogether all 50 states sue the tobacco company to recover money for healthcare. And then another second case is the United States vs. Philip Morris Department of Justice lawsuit violate and just rule that the tobacco company evaluated the racketeer influence, misled the public about the risk of smoking secondhand smoke, misrepresent the addictiveness, and manipulate the nicotine delivery, deceptive marketing, or target youth. I found this very useful and powerful to inform the public and the policy maker to denormalize the tobacco industry. And then we also did something, the global industry reputation, they survey their public opinion. 80,000 respondents, 32 countries, 25 industries, that tobacco was the last reputation. We did the same in Thailand. We found a doctor, teacher, judge was high on the rank, and then tobacco industry just above pub and bar operator, which in Thailand is really low esteem because the guy with the illegal, prostitution inside the business. Okay. So we publicize this, and year 2011, we started to draft. We want to change, to ban the tobacco industry by law. Totally. We have a ban on the electronic media, but we want to ban it altogether. And then plain packaging. There were these two provisions. The industry opposed the most. Okay, and then PMI started to have a letter to the MOS. They want to assist Thailand to draft the bill. Okay. Were rejected. So they set up Thai Tobacco Trade Association. Very interesting. More than 20 years they do business in Thailand. They did not have this association. And then they begin scholarship program to tobacco farmer children. So their intention is to use this group to oppose our two very important provision on the Tobacco Product Control Act, which is ban advertisement and plain packaging. So this is...
Sorry, Dr. Prakit, can I ask you to speed up a little bit? We're running out of time.
Okay. Okay, these are the billboard by the Retailer Association, and this by the Farmer Association. So we campaign to support the provision. We're using the FCTC obligation. We're using the UN system denying the tobacco industry. And then we're using other countries banning CSR. At the time, it's about 59 countries, and they mobilize social support. This is their side, this is our side. We got 10 million signatures to support the law. And then so we drafted the Article 35 ban prohibit CSR sponsorship, including funding research. We have to make some concession in the parliament because we cannot get it through if we want to insist that they cannot sponsor the tobacco trade supply chain, namely the retailer, the farmer. And then we require the industry to report on the trade practice. So this is the detail, try to cover as much as wide as possible. What we left now is the industry, the Foundation for Smoke-Free World. They're funding the pro e-cigarette group to lobby to change our law in the banning e-cigarette. So my conclusion is that denormalizing tobacco and TI sponsors is a lesson learned. First, you have to denormalize smoking, and then you denormalize the tobacco industry. You have to denormalize CSR. You refer to international organization policies, particularly UN, and then drafting legislation in line with full FCTC article guideline. And you just have to never give up and keep fighting. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prakit. If you can stop sharing the screen, I'd like to invite our final speaker. We have run out of time and we lost valuable time during the technical glitches. So our final speaker today is Attorney Debbie C. from the Philippines, and she joins us today from Manila. Debbie is the head of global public policy and strategies, and she did some really good groundwork in 2006-2007 on pictorial health warning in the Philippines, and also was instrumental in the development of the Philippines Civil Service Commission Department of Health Joint Memorandum Circular. And now Debbie will walk us through the wealth of information that's available out there in terms of resources available for the tobacco control community to use. Debbie, I invite you now to make your presentation.
Mary, hi
Yes,
everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can see. Please proceed.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mary, for the introduction. And my name is Debbie, and I'll be presenting on global best practices, resources, and tools. Before I start, a quick introduction. GGTC is a joint initiative of Thammasat University and SIATCA, works to support those who are countering tobacco industry interference. In 2017, it was designated as the Convention Secretariat's Knowledge Hub for Article 5.3. And in 2019, Bloomberg awarded it, along with BAF, Union Vital Strategies, to be a partner of STOP, a tobacco industry watchdog. Today, I will discuss first the scope of Article 5.3, the best practices, and then resources you can tap to learn more. Article 5.3, or the government's obligation to protect policies against tobacco industry interference, is known as the backbone of the treaty. The premise is that we cannot advance tobacco control if we allow tobacco industry to influence policy.
So, sorry, Debbie, can you click your slides? You've got to go to the next slide.
Is it moving?
No, it's not moving. It's not moving.
I have a problem with slide sharing.
Okay.
I have to do it. Is it working now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so Article 5.3 has guidelines adopted in 2008, and it's broken down to 8 recommendations. This includes raising awareness about tobacco industry tactics, limiting interaction with, rejecting partnerships and contributions of the tobacco industry, and generally avoiding conflicts of interest. It also includes regulating the industry by requiring information from it, denormalizing so-called CSR and not giving it preferential treatment, incentives, or benefits, and of course, treating state-owned enterprises the same. We could split the 8 recommendations into 3 parts: communications, governance, and regulation. Communication refers to raising awareness. Governance is about how officials should conduct themselves. And finally, regulation is about how governments must regulate the industry to make them accountable, requiring information from them, or denouncing their CSR, and granting them, not granting them any benefits or incentives. The communication is the most well implemented by governments or parties to the FCTC. So the way this is done is that some governments would put out press releases, talk about how they, for instance, sued the industry, such as Brazil, or they would be sending out letters and warnings. So for instance, Vietnam and Poland send out a letter to government ministries and to warn research institutions about the funding that's provided by Philip Morris to the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, saying that if it's found that the research has come from this money, that sort of research output will not be used in policy development. And some of these are communicated through policy. So for instance, there is a policy, as you've heard earlier, there is a policy in on Article 5.3 in the Philippines and in Australia and elsewhere. Next is some different ways that the governments have communicated, and I'm showing the same one that Prakit just showed. Many of these materials actually on exposing tobacco tactics are in English. So the effort to translate these to local language is really a good practice. So, and for instance, putting up a poster is also a good way to raise awareness. This is from the Philippine Social Welfare Department, which is in charge of regulating donations. Some countries have also endorsed their staff to join the global media competition. This is an example from El Salvador. This media competition is supposed to expose tobacco tactics. In a few countries, some reports are actually published. So for example, in Brazil, they produce a short document called "How Much Does It Cost to Receive Donations from the Tobacco Industry?" It's also important to hear other voices who support the messages against the industry. And amplifying these statements is a good way to raise awareness. So statements like, "The tobacco industry and sustainable development must not appear in the same sentence." Or, "Tobacco is a slow motion pandemic that is hindering the SDGs." And tobacco industry just changed clothes to sell vaping devices. And the tobacco industry is manipulating the youth and targeting a new generation. Okay. In terms of governance, or how government officials should conduct themselves in relation to tobacco control policy, many countries have a firewall to protect the tobacco control committees. Some specifically rejected partnerships or disallowed the industry to speak up or even show up at a meeting or hearing. So for instance, in a few countries where Philip Morris would go on a roadshow to show their anti-smuggling technology, some government officials have refused to hear their presentations. Some countries have a policy on hiring to avoid a revolving door situation where the tobacco industry is hired by government or the government official is hired by the tobacco industry. In Panama, a government official involved with tobacco control may not work with the tobacco industry 3 years after leaving office, and the government will not hire anyone who has been with the tobacco industry for the past 3 years. Several countries implement a declaration of interest form and require that this be filled up prior to joining meetings, committees, or events. Most of these types of governance policies are found in internal rules, but may also appear as provisions within tobacco control laws. This year, everyone attending the treaty conference, the COP, is required to fill up a declaration of interest form. This is mandatory for everyone except government delegates, which is voluntary for them. However, governments must make an affirmation that it has observed Article 5.3 and is mindful that it has not nominated to the COP anyone who is working to further the tobacco industry's interests. Among the 3 areas of Article 5.3 that I discussed, regulation cluster is the least implemented, apart from comprehensive bans on so-called CSR, because there are many efforts to denormalize tobacco industry CSR activities are covered under a TAPS ban or a tobacco advertising sponsorship ban. But in some cases, this is not enough. An additional step must be taken because the tobacco industry really exploits loopholes. Sorry, I can't move my screen. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Debbie, and time's running short.
All right. Let me check.
Your slides have been moving along smoothly up to now.
My screen froze. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. Sorry, can you tell me what slide this is now? Because I can't.
This is on regulation and practices on denormalizing, which is banning tobacco CSR activities
Right. Okay.
in Bangladesh, Philippines, India.
Right.
Right. Okay, it's moving.
Okay, good. Thank you. Very few parties to the treaty report on requiring information from the tobacco industry. However, France, Thailand, and Uganda has a list of information that they require from the tobacco industry. This includes their lobbying and marketing expenses, and to some extent, how this was spent. So Norway removed tobacco investments from its government portfolio, and several countries in Asia Pacific and Americas have excluded tobacco industry from the investors' treaty protection that allows foreign investors to sue governments. And during the pandemic, it will be important for governments to deny the tobacco industry any tax relief, as this would be giving them a benefit to run their business. The WHO Empower report echoed the recommendations of Article 5.3 guidelines as an important measure to address novel and emerging products, consistent with COP's 2018 decision adopted by consensus of over 180 parties. So the report reminds us about how Article 5.3 should be used to counter the evolving tactics of the tobacco and related industries. First, both documents tell us that both the recipient and the tobacco industry must disclose their interests. The tobacco industry must submit information about its funding and where the money goes, and ensure that research funded by such funds are not used in policy. Second, the report tells us that the scope is not just tobacco industry. It should cover the related industries. In fact, it's not just related industries, but any related third party, whether or not it is an industry. And both the WHO and the COP reminded us that the obligation to protect tobacco control is not just a health sector duty, but an obligation that extends to the whole government, especially including the non-health sector that are targeted by the industry. As the Convention Secretariat's Knowledge Hub, GGTC is constantly on the lookout as to how Article 5.3 is being implemented. In this brochure developed by the Knowledge Hub, we try to collect all this information so we can point the government to the right direction. We also try to host many of these resources in some of the key websites, such as our GGTC website, the Knowledge Hub website, and the STOPS website. We also try to coordinate the work of all the observatories who are committed to partnering with the government and the Secretariat to monitor tobacco industry interference. We also included references to all the monitoring centers. The Knowledge Hub has developed a guide for those who want to establish an observatory or a monitoring center on tobacco industry interference. GGTC also produced a handbook on Article 5.3 implementation, which contains many of the practices mentioned here. To really know the ins and outs of implementing Article 5.3, we have an online course that walks users through the guidelines and the tools to implement Article 5.3. If we are to communicate tobacco industry interference and seek Article 5.3 implementation, this is a must. Don't worry, it's quite a short course. If you need just a quick guide, you could just check out the Article 5.3 toolkit on which the course is based. It includes many of the basic templates. With the support of partners, GGTC organized several webinars hosted by STOP and/or the Knowledge Hub. This goes along with briefs on key issues like child labor, corruption, SDGs, and liability. In 2020, we launched a multimedia hub to house all visual materials we could find on tobacco industry interference. To add to this library, GGTC organized an annual global media competition with the support of partners, including the Treaty Secretariat and STOP, a global tobacco industry watchdog. Finally, another important resource is the civil society's Global Tobacco Index that is produced by GGTC for STOP. With the Global Tobacco Industry Interference Index, the civil society is able to measure the government's adherence to Article 5.3 across the world. And this year's report is coming in November, and you've heard much of the detail about this report earlier from Jenilyn. The Global Tobacco Index provides a digital tool that allows users to print or share a customized fact sheet that sums up the impact of the tobacco industry's influence over life-saving policies. Finally, with the support of its partners, GGTC as a knowledge hub provides technical assistance to counter tobacco industry tactics upon request of parties through the WHO FCTC Convention Secretariat. We also provide technical assistance through a facility called REACT that is available at the STOPS website. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Ladies and gentlemen, we are 2 minutes across the hour, which means we have run out of time. I have not received any questions in the chat box either. So may I take this opportunity to thank all our speakers for their excellent presentation. I'm sure you have some questions, and you can direct them and contact us directly after the session. But as you can see that there is a wealth of information out there. Dr. Praket has, walked us through how to step by step how to counter the tobacco industry. You've heard an example from Australia from Jack with regards to how the government has applied a whole of government approach. So with those presentations, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and all the best to you. And please stay in touch, and we shall together defeat industry interference. Thank you once again.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all speakers and Mary. There is an announcement for participants. From noon to 1 p.m. and including all speakers, we invite you all and speakers to join the special sessions. The special session will be about the wrap-up of the 13th APACT, and we are going to also introduce you about the closing ceremony, which is going to happen and take place this afternoon. So let's take the journey together, and let's join the session from noon in a few minutes now, actually. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that announcement. Thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy your lunch.